Hello, I'm Jordan, and I recently reread The Hobbit by Tolkien for the first time since I was about 10, I think, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. There was a lot more here for me as an adult than I was expecting. I'm not going to go into a synopsis here because I'm assuming that if you're watching this, you've already read it, and if you haven't, just be aware there may be spoilers in this video. But yeah, as I was saying, there was more going on here than I expected. It is a fun book. I think most people would agree that it's tremendous fun. It's a relatively easy read. It is a children's book. I'm not going to argue that it's not a children's book, but I think there is something bigger going on here that perhaps would go over the head of most children. It certainly went over my head. Um, I think it's doing things quite different, I think, than even some of its contemporaries, like Lord Dunsany or E.R. Edison, both of which are fantastic writers. I would highly recommend checking them out. But I think Tolkien has a different approach in two ways. One, first of all, his characters. I think Tolkien gets a bad rap for having flat characters. That's true, certainly to a certain extent. Like, there's no reason for there to be 13 dwarves in this book, other than the fact that it's a silly number of dwarves. Only about two of them actually have distinct personalities. But it's not entirely true. The characters in this book, I think, and in The Lord of the Rings, I think, are quite good. Of course, the character of Bilbo, but also the side characters like Gollum and Smaug, both of which really steal the show in the chapters that they're in a big way. But the character of Bilbo himself is fascinating. Lukas just made a video about The Hobbit where he kind of pointed out the odd fact that Bilbo is middle-aged in this story. He's in his 50s. So does that make The Hobbit a midlife crisis story? Does it make it, as Lukas said, a coming-of-age story for an adult? It's very interesting in that way, especially the things that Bilbo learns about himself and the things that Bilbo learns about his world, that is Tolkien's world. And the way the book is structured is interesting in that you seem to be learning about this world, which is much bigger than the book, as Tolkien is and as Bilbo is. So there's this amateurish quality to it that really comes across well, I think, and it's similar to the structure in Lord of the Rings. In fact, there's a lot of similarities between this and Lord of the Rings. It doesn't do justice to either one of them to say it, but I do think this is kind of Lord of the Rings in miniature. You have, the old abandoned mines. You have the eagles. You have the motif of the returning king. You have Gollum, of course. There's a lot that repeats in the two, which is not to disparage either one of them. But anyways, yes, the characterization is very good, I think. And it's also, I think, Tolkien plays with it in interesting ways through Bilbo as a hobbit in this world that is far bigger than him. I think, if you'll pardon the absurdity of it, what came to mind was actually Hamlet, because Hamlet, to me, is a character that knows he's in a play and resents it. And Bilbo, I think, becomes a character that knows he is the hero in an epic fantasy novel. And he plays with that. He doesn't resent it, but he's not exactly comfortable with it. He takes on the role, or it's put on him, and he kind of plays with it. I'm thinking particularly of the scene where he confronts Smaug, and he refuses to give Smaug his actual name. Instead, he gives him all of these riddling, funny, kind of inflated titles that have to do with his previous adventures. And to me, the effect is Bilbo mocking Smaug, mocking himself, and also to a certain extent mocking the story. And Tolkien does that a lot, where he'll have this epic world, but he'll constantly bring it back into the focus of hobbits, who are not particularly invested in it, and who are able to adapt in ways that almost make it seem cheap. I think he does the same thing in Lord of the Rings. One of my favorite scenes in Lord of the Rings is when Frodo and Sam are above the Morgul Vale, and it's one of the darkest moments of their journey, and they just sit around talking about themselves as characters in a legend. It's quite interesting. But the other thing that I think Tolkien does, which is above his peers, and which shouldn't work but does, is that he has a very unusual narrative technique, I would say. I think most people would agree that this book and The Lord of the Rings are so effective, partly because they're so immersive and so fun to read. But really, if you look at the storytelling going on, it shouldn't work. The pacing shouldn't work. For example, in this book, when the dwarves and Bilbo finally reach the Lonely Mountain, which has been the focus of their quest up to that point, they stall. They hesitate. There's a lot of wrangling and figuring out and bickering and figuring out what they're going to do. It goes on for days, and it's a testament to Tolkien's storytelling abilities that does not kill the momentum of the book. Far from it. I think that's partly because... Sorry, I got a situation here. It's partly because Tolkien is just I think, a very fabulous writer. And it's partly because I would argue he's using as his precedent not books like The War of Ouroboros by Edison or anything by Lord Dunsany. He's using as his precedent, I think, kind of ancient literature and legends where you can have that kind of thing. Like, think of in the Odyssey how much downtime there is in that poem, or in Beowulf there are decades that pass in the middle of the action, and those are both fantastic stories. So I think Tolkien was tapping into that sensibility and trusting it in a way that perhaps would not fly these days. So it makes for a very interesting and unusual read. I think we should give Tolkien more credit for how unusual his narrative decisions are and for how well they come off often. So anyways, those are my thoughts on The Hobbit. All of that aside, like I said, it's just a very, very fun book. So if you haven't read it, I highly recommend you finally get to it. And if you have, let me know what you think of it and what you think of my thoughts here. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.